Hey gang, been dealing with a few illnesses around the family the past couple of days, so I wanted to put something together a little bit before Thanksgiving, before a new Thanksgiving episode. So here's a best of. And if you do have a true scary story about Thanksgiving before we get to the holiday, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please enjoy this best of true scary Thanksgiving stories. An Awful Thanksgiving, submitted by Jessie. I'm a 28-year-old female. Call me Jessie. Last year, my Thanksgiving night went from crap to worse. My boyfriend was a resident at a hospital in our city and had to work on Thanksgiving Day. We knew about it, and our families lived back in Seattle, and we were in Miami at the time. Our grandparents lived back there as well, and it was just easier for us to spend the year apart. I mean, it sucked, but it made sense as I didn't have the day off after either. I thought about making the turkey and all the trimmings, but Sven and I decided to wait until that weekend when we would both be at home and celebrate together then. He took off for work around noon, and I knew he wouldn't be back until after midnight, so I just did stuff around the townhouse and then opted for Chinese food. I ordered some takeout, drove out to the place to pick it up, and on my way out of the building, I noticed only one other car in the strip mall parking lot. It was this big old blue car, like 80s big. There was a guy and a woman standing next to it smoking cigarettes, and I figured they were just waiting for their own order to be ready, and then I just got into my car. As I was doing that, I dropped my purse and all my junk spilled out onto the ground. I picked it up and got into my car and then drove home to watch junk TV and eat junk food. I was missing Sven and texted him once in a while, but he was really busy and didn't always get back to me right away. I FaceTimed with my family and his family later, and then just went back to vegging on TV. That's when I heard something outside. Let me explain. We lived in a set of townhouses, 5 to a building. We rented one on the end of the building, so we had a deck in back and windows on the far side. And part of the reason we wanted that unit was to catch the morning sun. Well, I heard a soft tapping noise at one of the windows in our living room, and so did my cat Rizzo. My other cat, Frank, yes, we're fans of the Jerky Boys, was upstairs but came down later, and I'll get to that. I went over to the left window and looked out, and there was nothing out there. It was starting to get darker, so I went to turn on a light, and that's when I heard the tapping coming from a window in the dining room next to the living room. Rizzo ran over there and meowed loudly, and that's when Frank came down. I followed, but again, there was nothing there. I looked up and down the tree line that was out there, but there was just nothing, so I chalked it up to the wind and went to get a glass of wine. That's when the doorbell rang. I went to it and looked out the side window first, and again, no one was there. I was starting to get scared and texted Sven. No reply for 10 minutes, and then a "probably just kids messing around" message came through. I decided to calm down and take my Staffy Bugsy for a quick walk before it got too dark. He's a great dog, but he can be menacing with strangers. He's awesome to have when I'm home alone, and he loves chasing Frank and Rizzo. He was actually sleeping on the back deck when the bell rang, otherwise he would have been on that like stink on a monkey. So I walked him around our complex, which was pretty big, and on the way back, I noticed that big old blue car I saw at the strip mall restaurant. It was parked in a community area across the street from our place. And again, not thinking clearly, I blew it off. Maybe it wasn't the same car, I thought. I got Bugsy inside and gave him a treat and grabbed my wine I had left out. And that's when my phone buzzed, and a text from an unknown number said, "So sad. Home alone on Turkey Day." Thinking it was a friend from work, I just wrote back, "I'm fine, who's this?" There was nothing for a few minutes, and then another text. "You know who." And who was spelled wrong. It was spelled H-O-O. Yeah, really smart. I said I didn't know who it was, and if they weren't going to tell me, to just go fuck off. Nothing for a few minutes. And then I got another text that said, "This wine is tasty. You have good taste." I looked at my glass and then went into the kitchen. The bottle was no longer on the counter where I left it. I then began thinking maybe I had left the front door open when I went outside, and one of the kids that maybe was messing around came in and grabbed it. I was kind of buzzed and not thinking super straight. I just replied, "Knock it off. Enjoy it and leave me alone. I'm blocking you." And that's what I did. Hooray for iPhones. But a few minutes later, I got another text. "Oh, that's not nice." Again, I texted, "Seriously, who is this?" No response. I texted Sven again and then tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I was getting freaked out at this point, but not panicking. And then I got another text. "This is a very nice place you have. I love your dresser and mirror." That's when I nearly pooped my pants. I did have a very ornate bedroom set my grandmother had given me. At this point, I was standing in our front foyer looking up the stairs, and then another text came through. "Come on up, sexy." That was it. I dialed 911 and ran into my living room. Why I didn't go out the front door, you ask? When I had turned around while I was calling, the doorbell rang, and then Bugsy came flying over to see who was at the door. Over my dog barking, I told the person on the line that I thought someone was in my house and that there was someone else outside. They told me to calm down and they'd send someone out as quickly as possible. I got another text while I was on the line and it said, "That was a bad idea." And I told the dispatcher that too. "Someone really needs to get out here," I said. And by now, Bugsy had left the front door and was at our French doors at the back patio going crazy over there. And that's when my phone died. I started crying, calling for Bugsy, and could hear someone banging on the French doors. But then it stopped, and a few minutes later it started again at the front door. Now I was panicking. My phone charger was upstairs, and I was not leaving the living room until the police came. That's when I remembered I had my work laptop on our dining room table. I'm a realtor, and I use a phone Skype line to make calls once in a while, and as scared as I was, as crazy as Bugsy was going, I got the courage up to turn on my laptop and started yelling for Skype to open. I called my boyfriend's hospital and screamed at the woman who answered to get Sven. This was an emergency. I then yelled for Bugsy, and he came running over to me and sat down. And that's when I heard something or someone moving around upstairs. I said I was panicked before, but now I was beyond terrified. Everything got real quiet. The front doorbell rang again, and a muffled voice said, "Police, open up. Are you okay?" I didn't know if it was a trick or what, and Bugsy ran to the door. Thankfully, I looked outside and saw a police car in front of our place. The person at the door yelled to get my dog back, and I got Bugsy into the kitchen and told him to stay. He's a very smart dog, by the way. I went back to the front door, and there was this big policeman standing there, and I let him in. And before I could say a word, he said, "Are you all right?" I nodded, and he opened the door wider and asked, "Do you know this guy?" Standing out front was the guy I had seen with the big car. He was being held by another policeman. I shook my head, and the man I was talking to said, "Detain him." The other policeman said something into his radio, and the two walked away. And I got my senses back, and I said, "I think there's somebody upstairs." The policeman yelled out for them to come down slowly with their hands visible at all times. There was silence other than Bugsy whining in the kitchen. He wanted to help, but he also knew his commands. The policeman yelled again, and there was a shuffling. And down the stairs came this woman I had seen with the other guy, except she was wearing some of my lingerie. She had this crazy smile on her face as she walked down with her hands in front of her. The policeman just turned her around, handcuffed her, and asked her name. She didn't say anything, just kept that weird smile going. He said something into his radio too, and the other policeman came running up and took her by the arm. The first policeman told me to wait where I was, and then his partner came back, and they both went upstairs. After a few seconds, there was some shouting and a loud thump on the floor that broke Bugsy's training, and he came running to me. After more shouting and thumps, the policeman came downstairs with another woman who had been hiding in our bedroom closet. They all went outside as Bugsy barked at the woman, and I had him on his lead by that time. A few minutes later, the first policeman came back, and Sven was with him. He'd heard something was wrong, and when I didn't answer anyone on the Skype call I made, he came flying home. There were tons of questions, and another policewoman came in and asked me if anything was missing or broken. I told her nothing was broken, no windows or doors, but I hadn't been upstairs, and I admitted that I wasn't sure if I had left the front door unlocked. She and I went upstairs as Sven talked to the policeman, and when we went into my bedroom, the French doors on the back deck were open. They were the same kind of doors that we had downstairs. But what was freaky was there were ropes tied to each of the 4 posts on our bed, and there was a bag on the floor with duct tape, more ropes, and some knives. Oh, and a bunch of crystal meth. Outside on the deck, there was an extension ladder propped up. The property manager had left it out, and that's how they got in. As we pieced everything together, when I had dropped my purse, some business cards fell out, and I didn't see them. They must have gone under my car. On my card was my cell number. They had followed me home after they saw me at the Chinese place. The police took all of them away, and they were all totally shot on meth. And they all also had warrants out for them as well. What swell people. When asked why they followed me and broke in, one of the women said that I looked fun. When asked about the bag and ropes, she again said, "Well, doesn't she look fun?" Everything calmed down as best it could, and Sven stayed with me as I cried and cried. The cats were hiding somewhere due to the commotion, and Bugsy sat at my feet on the couch. All 3 of them were charged but were extradited to Georgia on bigger charges, and I only had to do a Zoom deposition, so I never saw them again. After that, I convinced Sven to see if he could get something back home in Seattle, and that's when we moved. We're looking forward to a calmer Thanksgiving with the family this year. I'll keep you posted. Black Friday Insanity, submitted by Mark265. 3 years ago, my sister convinced me and my brother to go to a large electronics place on Black Friday at like 4 a.m. Both of us don't live in our hometown anymore and said, "What the hell? Maybe we can score some cool stuff." We took a long nap after dinner and then woke up around midnight. We had a snack and then jumped into my sister's SUV. Allie was driving, and me and Jeff were planning on having a few road pops and some smoky on the way to make it more fun. When we got to the place, it was already mobbed with people waiting in this long-ass line. Jeff said, "Fuck this, let's just go home." But I told him Schmef Schmai had a deal on 65-inch OLED TVs that we couldn't miss out on. So we hung out in the car waiting for the doors to open and avoid the crazy rush of all the tools that do this every year. After a while, we were pretty toasted. My sister was shaking her head, and in we went. It was a madhouse. People fighting for this and that, people screaming at each other, totally effed up scene. We went to see about the TVs and if we could buy them and then pick them up later. And it turned out they had a few left as the cheaper TVs went quick, but we had to take the ones that we wanted right then. It also turned out that we got the last 2. Jeff and I high-fived, and he ran to get a card. We paid up, high as kites, and ran back to Allie's Armada. She's a dentist and makes serious bank. We'd taken the 3rd row out in anticipation of scoring the TVs. As we were putting them in, this dude in a hoodie walked up and asked if we wanted to sell one of them. He offered way more than what we paid for them, but we said, "No thanks, happy Thanksgiving." We managed to wedge them in and close the door and then went to go back home. The guy spoke up again and then offered even more money, and I said, "Hey man, no thanks." We just asked my sister to go to a Dunkin' Donuts nearby that was going to open up soon. I mean, we were ravenous after the smoky. As we were pulling away, another vehicle got right behind us. Jeff and I were so happy about our grab, we weren't paying attention. But Allie finally said, "Guys, this car is right on our ass." I looked back and wow, the car was so close I could see it was there, but the lights were dim because there was like no room between it and my sister's SUV. I had a sinking feeling about who it was, and my brother and I got the cobwebs out quick. We told Allie to skip the coffee and donuts and just get us home. She was way ahead of us and made some pretty smart maneuvers to lose this vehicle, and managed a solid fake-out during a last-minute U-turn and then jumping onto a freeway. We were all talking about how weird it was and just wanting to get back to my parents' house. As we were a few miles down the road, my sister said she saw lights coming up quick. By now it was around 5:30 a.m., and hardly much traffic out. The vehicle pulled right up alongside us, and there was a guy hanging out of the window with a gun. He was yelling something we couldn't hear, but we were back to being freaked out. Jeff told my sister to wait for the next exit and to take it at the last minute. Allie was not having a good time at the wheel, but she went into what we called her bitch mode. She flipped off the guy, slammed on the brakes, and then hit the gas at the last second to get on the off-ramp. She started yelling at us about going out to Black Friday and fuck your TVs, but she started driving in an erratic pattern to get back to my parents and lose this car. After a few minutes, we thought we were in the clear. But nope, they found us again. I called my dad and told him what was up, and he said to be safe and just to get home, and hung up. The car kept up with us, again riding my sister's bumper, and Jeff told her to slam on the brakes and let him hit us. We could just call the cops. She said no way and kept heading on home. These guys, who we assumed were the nuts from Schmefschmai trying to get our TVs, stayed with us until we got back to my parents' house. My parents lived way out in the country, with the closest neighbors maybe a mile to each side. But Allie slowed and pulled into our long driveway, and these guys did as well. She parked, and two guys jumped out with handguns but stopped dead in their tracks when they heard a loud boom. My dad was in the driveway holding his side-by-side bird gun he just shot into the turf on the side of their car. We were still in the SUV, but through the mirrors we watched as the guys jumped back into their car and backed up like all hell and then got back onto the road and tore away. Allie was shaking with adrenaline, and my dad came running up. He only said, "Pull into the shed now." He called his second garage that had his tractor and stuff in there his shed. Allie pulled in, we locked the doors, ran into the house, and my dad called the sheriff to tell them what happened. Nothing else happened, and we collapsed after that craziness. And we woke up later that morning to my mom's breakfast and coffee and talked about it some more. Never again. I will never go to Black Friday sales. Getting threatened with guns over TVs? Nope. Next time I'll just pay full price and skip that bullshit. And wherever those guys are, fuck them. Get a job and buy your own stuff, losers. When I Gave Up Crime, submitted by Anonymous. I'm not sharing my name or location for obvious reasons. I'll start by saying that I'm not proud of what I have done or who I was. My family was kind of on the dark side of the family tree when I was growing up, and it spilled over onto me. My father was involved in a lot of shady shit. My mom left him for another guy, and my brother and I grew up basically on our own. My dad was never around. We got into lots of trouble, and not just the telling off a teacher or whatever, but real trouble with the law. For a while we were never arrested, but we were taken away to be scared straight at first. But then I finally did get arrested for breaking into a neighbor's home. Honestly, I didn't even intend to go in to steal anything. I just got a rush from that sort of thing. Anyway, my rap sheet grew. I stole a car with a friend, did 6 months in Junior Disneyland Hotel, and still didn't learn my lesson. I turned 18, left home, and my father didn't give a shit, and neither did my mom. I haven't spoken to them since. I got my GED and just said, I'm out of here. I moved in with a buddy, a real rat hole apartment, and I just got deeper and deeper into crime. And this time I was breaking into places to steal. Stores, houses, warehouses, any place I could go to get something. I did have a real day job, but like I said, I had this desire to get a rush out of stealing. For anyone listening that knows what I'm talking about, I became a very solid second story man. My roommate would brag at bars about me, and guys would pull me over to do jobs. We'd go to cities and towns far away from us and scope things out, and then blammo! I'd get us in unlocked windows or doors, and it got so that I could climb just about anything or use stuff to get up there. I'd go in, go down to the door, and let everyone in. This was back in the mid-2000s. I got an urge to go to Arizona, but needed some money. So I was saving my work money, but figured I could hit up a house or two on Thanksgiving. I never stole jewelry. That's a pain in the ass to get rid of in a pawn shop or dealer, so I would just focus on small electronics. Crap I could sell on Craigslist or whatever. So I went 2 towns over from mine and started looking through this neighborhood that seemed pretty posh. I looked for homes with families and figured there's gotta be video game consoles, computers, stuff like that. So one Thanksgiving morning, I sat in my car watching who was coming and going on this street. There were 2 houses that had sun porches in the back, and I knew I could get up onto them and then do my thing through a window. I'd learned a trick from a quote-unquote mentor, and that was to wear a hard hat and a safety vest. This way, if a neighbor saw me out there, they would think, or in theory think, I was just some kind of worker. Well, sure enough, one of the houses cleared out. I watched the family leave. I assumed they were going somewhere for Thanksgiving dinner, but seriously, I didn't give a shit. I just wanted in, get some stuff, and then beat it. I walked around the back of this house with my gear and gloves, and I got onto the roof, jimmied a window, all the while looking around to see if anyone was looking at me. Popped the screen, popped the lock, and was in like Flynn. It was a bedroom that I got into, so I just grabbed a pillowcase and got to work. I found a laptop, a PlayStation, and some other stuff and just jammed it into the bag. I went from room to room, but one door I really had to push on, and this is where things went from payday to oh shit. There was something in the way of me pushing the door open. I gave it a heavy shove, just wanting to get more stuff, and the door gave way, and what I saw will haunt me forever. In the room, which smelled so badly of urine and feces, was an old woman strapped to a bed sitting upright. She looked like that guy in the movie Seven. I could see her bones through her skin, and her eyes looked at me with zero feeling. Then I noticed what had been blocking the door. It was an old man in a wheelchair, also strapped in by his arms and legs, and he looked like he was asleep, just kind of slumped over. I stopped what I was doing. This was so gross, I almost puked. I stood for a minute, and then like a jack-off asked, "Are you okay?" The woman kind of looked at me and lolled her head. I'm a thief. I'm standing in a room that smells like death with a safety vest and a white hard hat asking 2 people who are clearly being neglected and abused if they're okay. I did the only thing I thought was right. I closed the door, I put all the stuff I was about to steal back where I found it, and got out of there. Fuck the screen. I just shut the window, climbed down, and ran to my piece-of-shit Civic. Shaking and sitting in my car, I lit a cigarette and made doubly sure of the address and then drove to a public school where I knew there was still a payphone. Yeah, imagine that, a payphone. I even walked backwards towards it so the security camera couldn't see my face. I dialed 911 and told them what I had just seen and was completely clear that I had broken in and this was not a joke. The woman who answered didn't believe me at first, but I basically just screamed into the phone that I wasn't kidding, and I was leaving the phone off the hook as proof. I ran back to my car, peeled out of the parking lot, and I'm sure other cameras saw me, but no one ever contacted me. I went to a 7-Eleven, bought some more smokes, and then just sat there terrified. Who the hell does something like that to old people? Just box them up and leave them in a room? A while later, I did what no criminal ever should do. I went back to that street to see if anyone had showed up. Thankfully, they did. I drove right up, not slowing down, but a firefighter slowed me down and told me I had to turn around. There were 2 ambulances and cops all over the place, too. I turned around in a driveway, went back to my crappy apartment, and started packing my stuff. I was done ripping people off and was heading for Arizona that night. I have no idea what became of those 2 old folks or their fucked up family. But every Thanksgiving, I think about what I saw, and I like to think that maybe I atoned for some of my sins by calling the cops. In a goofy way, I'm thankful I was kind of a piece of human garbage at that time, because maybe, just maybe, that broke me through, and maybe I saved some people in my desire to serve myself with their stuff. Why I'm not a fan of Thanksgiving. Submitted by Curmudgeon. Ever since I was a kid, Thanksgiving always seemed to be a complete pain in the ass. If we were traveling to other parts of the family, or I had people at our house, no matter where we had Thanksgiving, crazy shit always went down. Most of it at our house. My dad's half-brother was a mess. I'll call him Uncle Fred for this story. Uncle Fred was always in trouble with the law and was a serious drug addict. At first, he was just a pothead, and as kids we would laugh at all the funny things he would say when he was high. But as time went on, he got into much harder things, and the times we would get together were crazy. It got to the point where my mother started to ask my dad to not invite him for safety reasons. But my dad would always fight with her, and Uncle Fred was always part of the holidays. I think that's because my dad's mother was getting more frail, and he didn't want to deny her seeing her son even though he was a mess. I remember one time when I was in high school, he showed up at Thanksgiving with his new girlfriend, who was very pretty, but also a mess. She was also a drug addict, and that's probably how they got together. I don't know what they were on, but they were definitely on something, and it was making the afternoon uncomfortable for everyone else. The crazy stuff coming out of his mouth turned into fairly violent talk, and everyone was nervous that he was going to do something. I can't remember what started the fight, but they were talking as adults do, and my father or my other uncle said something that Uncle Fred didn't like. At first, his girlfriend tried to calm him down, but my father finally took him by the arm and said, "Hey, Fred, I need to talk to you about something in the kitchen." Now that I recall it, it was my other uncle who had said something, and my dad was trying to defuse the situation. Uncle Fred's girlfriend saw my dad pulling him by the arm gently and flipped out. She thought my dad was going to hit him or something, and she started screaming at the top of her lungs all kinds of swear words and threats to my family. It was such a swing of mood that none of us even knew what to say. My dad just continued to pull Fred into the kitchen, but after a moment, we heard stuff smashing. Uncle Fred was picking up dishes and glasses and just throwing them at the wall. He wasn't saying anything or yelling anything. He was just breaking stuff. My dad finally got him in a bear hug, and we all kind of ran over to see what was happening. My dad just calmly said, "Fred, it's time for you to leave." His girlfriend was still going crazy and started to push her way into the kitchen. My mother turned to her and said, "Hang on, let's just calm down." And the girlfriend full-on slapped my mother in the face. This set everyone off. My mother and aunt grabbed her by the arms and started dragging her to the front door. This girlfriend was kicking and screaming and swearing at everyone, saying she was going to come back and burn our house down and kill us all. Uncle Fred wasn't saying anything. He was just standing there with this funny look on his face. My dad finally said, "Fred, you really need to go." Fred started to apologize about the dishes and losing his cool. My dad said, "Look, don't worry about it. Forget it. I'll take care of it." Meanwhile, my mom and aunt had thrown the girlfriend out, and my uncle followed. Later that night, after everyone else had gone home and it was just me, my sister, and my parents, the phone started to ring, and it was Fred's girlfriend just screaming. Whoever answered the phone hung up, but she continued to call back over and over. It got to the point where my father just took the phone off the cradle and wouldn't let the calls come through. At about 1 a.m, we heard a loud crash from downstairs in our family room. I stayed in bed just sitting up wondering what was going on, but my dad ran downstairs to find a brick from our garden had been thrown through one of our windows. We couldn't prove it, but we all knew who it was. Dad cleaned up the mess, temporarily fixed the window before repairing it the next day. I remember my dad calling Uncle Fred later that afternoon, and him pointing at me and telling me to get out of the room. He wasn't mad at me, it was just one of those dad things. I left, but I just went around the corner, and I heard my dad very calmly but very sternly telling Fred that he was not welcome at our house anymore. He was not going to be a part of any family events that we were having. He brought up the brick and said while we couldn't prove who did it, we all knew who it was. He also told him that if we could find out that she was the one who broke the window, there would be hell to pay. Of course, I couldn't hear what Uncle Fred was saying back, but my dad was getting angrier and angrier. Finally, after a pause, he said, "If you ever fucking come near my kids again like you did yesterday, I am not going to be as polite and just ask you to leave." When my dad said that, I immediately left from hiding around the corner and went up to my room. We never heard from Uncle Fred after all of that. That is, until 3 years later, when he reached out to my dad to let him know that he had cleaned up his act, got a steady job and had been to rehab, and was asking for my dad's forgiveness. My dad did forgive him, and as my grandmother was getting older and even more frail, my dad caved and invited him back for Thanksgiving. My mother was nervous, but she went along. This time, Uncle Fred was fine and really didn't say much. He spent most of the day watching football and then coming in to eat with us, but didn't share a lot and just said he was happy to be there. At some point, he left the table again and then shortly came back and said he was leaving and thanks so much for allowing him to be there. He left and that was it. Or so we thought. Well, when Fred had left, he had raided me and my sister's rooms and stole a bunch of our stuff. I had a lot of football and hockey cards that were worth some money, and I'm not talking players of the day. My grandfather had left me a bunch of older players, and the cards were all in excellent condition. If I had to value them out, it was probably almost $1,000 worth of cards. He also walked out with my sister's flute. We didn't realize any of this at the time, and quite frankly, outside of my sister's flute, I didn't even realize my cards were gone as I had them in a storage box that I rarely looked at. Years later, it was when I figured it out. When my sister realized her flute was gone, my parents grilled her about where it really was. She was constantly forgetting it at school, on the bus, so it was assumed that that's what she had done. My parents were convinced she had left it someplace where somebody might have picked it up and walked off with it. They never once considered Uncle Fred was the culprit. We went to my grandmother's that Christmas to celebrate, but Uncle Fred wasn't there. Apparently, he was on a trip with his new girlfriend. When my mother asked my grandmother, who was pretty senile at this point, who Uncle Fred was dating, she said she didn't remember and had only met her once. Again, what could we think? We only heard from Uncle Fred once in a while, and he didn't come around to any of our other family get-togethers until the next Thanksgiving. By this time, I was a sophomore in college and home with my then-girlfriend. Uncle Fred was invited and came over with his girlfriend, the same one from years before. She looks horrendous and clearly has not cleaned up her act. It was also pretty obvious right away that Uncle Fred was messed up as well. This time, everything was fine, no one argued, and it was a really pleasant meal. It would turn out to be my grandmother's last, sadly. After dinner, we were all just kind of talking and having more pie and coffee when we heard yelling coming from the living room. The rest of us were all in the family room in the back, and my dad got up to see what was going on. Uncle Fred's girlfriend was screaming at him and had scratched his face with her nails so badly that he was bleeding. He was trying to fight her off and calm her down, but she was so far gone that he couldn't control her. My dad stepped in to try to help calm her down, but she broke away and ran to the dining room table, grabbed the knife we were using to carve the turkey, and ran back into the living room, waving the knife around in the air. By now, everyone else is starting to come over to see what the hell was going on, and my mother screams when she sees Uncle Fred's face and this out-of-control woman stabbing at the air with a knife. My aunt had enough of it and ran to the phone and called 911. She came back as things were slowly starting to come under control as Uncle Fred's girlfriend had put the knife down, but was still looking like a crazed animal. My aunt informed everyone that she just called the police and they were on their way. And this is when Uncle Fred snapped. He called my aunt a bitch and picked up the knife himself. My dad told him to put it down, but then Uncle Fred started threatening everyone with it. I just grabbed my girlfriend and took her to the family room, held her in a huge hug, and told her it was going to be okay. She was freaking out. Then I heard my dad yell out and say, "You crazy motherfucker, you just stabbed me!" Now my mother is screaming, my aunt is screaming, and my other uncle has now literally punched my uncle unconscious. This, of course, sets off crazy girlfriend who just runs out of the house. My dad is checking out his arm where he'd been stabbed and was clearly going to need stitches, so my aunt and uncle helped him wrap his arm up in a towel to take him to the emergency room. My sister was in the family room with me and my girlfriend, and she was crying her eyes out, and of course you can see why. But this is where the train really went off the rails. Before my uncle and father can leave to go to the hospital, crazy girlfriend comes back into the house with a .38. The look in her eyes was terrifying. I had left my girlfriend and sister back in the family room and was talking to my uncle and dad before they left, so we were all kind of standing in a hallway. Uncle Fred's girlfriend starts firing the pistol at us from the door. Thank God she was not only a lousy shot, but obviously messed up because nothing hit home. But I'll tell you what, if you've never heard a firearm being shot in an enclosed area like a house, holy God, is it loud. Everyone at this point is either screaming or yelling and freaking out. Uncle Fred is still lying on the floor, completely unconscious, and crazy girlfriend screams that she's going to come back and kill all of us, just like she had years before. She runs out of the house into the front yard, right into a police officer who was checking out what was going on. He obviously had heard the shots, as did our neighbors who had come out to see what the hell was going on. The officer got the girlfriend down on the ground, and she was swearing at him, saying she was going to kill him too. The officer called for another car, and shortly, 2 more cars pulled up into our driveway. Now everyone in the neighborhood is standing out in their front yards watching what's going on. The police called an ambulance for my dad, despite my uncle saying that he could take him to the hospital. My mom went with my dad, my aunt and uncle stayed with us, and Uncle Fred was also hauled off after we had told the police what had happened. It felt like they were there forever asking us questions, but it probably wasn't that long looking back. Finally, things calmed down, but we were going to have to proffer charges the next day if we wanted anything to be done. And of course we did. My girlfriend lived in a city about an hour and a half away, and I told her that I was going to take her home, and she wanted me to stay with her for the rest of the weekend. I told her I really couldn't do that without talking to my parents first to make sure they might need me around or not. She was just scared and I wanted her to be safe, so I figured I would take her home. I ended up driving her home that night and then driving back after talking to her parents about what had happened. I later found out that the mother was the reason we broke up. She said she didn't want her daughter around crazy people like my extended family. And now that I look at it, I don't blame her. We lasted for the rest of that school year, but that was it. There was always an issue between us again. And again, I don't blame her. Uncle Fred went to jail, and we found out he also had 2 warrants out on him for drug-related charges. So much for him cleaning up his act. My dad had had enough and pressed charges on the stabbing. Fred did go to jail for a few years, but I know he was released. It doesn't matter. I've never seen him since, and he could be dead for all I know. His crazy girlfriend was also charged with all kinds of things that I would actually probably have to take an entire page to write out. I won't bore everybody with that. But what I will say is part of her defense was that she was on some drugs that made her temporarily crazy. It actually worked, and she was sent to a medical institution until they determined she was fit to stand trial. That never happened, and as far as I know, she's still in that place. Quite frankly, who knows? Maybe it did make her snap, but I guess that's making excuses for poor behavior. Other crazy stuff happened on Thanksgivings to follow in the next few years, but nothing that scary or that messed up. One year my sister had her car stolen on Thanksgiving evening, and my mother had a heart attack a couple of years later on Thanksgiving morning. So, yeah, there's a reason why I really don't care about Thanksgiving as much as everybody else. I like being together with my family, but that day just always reminds me of the nuttiness of the holiday. I think I'm pretty justified as to why I feel that way. Cousin Charlie, submitted by Redemption City. My junior year of college, I met a girl who would become my girlfriend for the next few years of my life. I will call myself John for this story, and my girlfriend Jill, just to protect the names of the innocent, etc., etc. Not that anything terrible happens in this story, but I just want to keep everything on the up and up. We had met in the spring before this happened, and kept in touch over the summer before deciding to become an item when we returned for our junior year. As the semester went on, she asked me if I would like to meet her family over Thanksgiving. I had plans with my family, but it was going to be in roughly the same town where she lived. We didn't live in the same city, so I thought this is going to work out awesome. I'd get to see my family, and then hopefully make a decent impression on hers. Everything was going great at my Thanksgiving, and I left a little early to make my way in unfamiliar territory to my new girlfriend's house. I let Jill know I was on my way, and off I went. I got there about an hour before they planned on eating, and her family welcomed me very warmly. She had 2 older brothers who were really cool guys and were into guitar just like me. We had a lot to talk about, as her father was a former musician as well, so conversation was easy. Jill's mother was just as nice, and I was on cloud 9, just sitting with my beautiful girlfriend and her family, who seemed to take a liking to me right away. We planned on jamming after dinner, and I was looking forward to that. And as the meal went on, it was great. I just couldn't believe this was such a cool family, and I was really feeling lucky. After a beer or 2 before dinner, some wine during dinner, and then another beer afterwards, we decided to jam in the basement. They had a whole array of instruments, as her father was multi-talented. There were, of course, guitars, basses, a drum kit, a piano, and man, I was in heaven, and we set to rocking out. Her brothers were really good on both guitar and bass, and her father was a very accomplished drummer, so I took up another guitar, and we just started talking about what to play. More beers appeared, and we were just playing rock and roll tunes that her father liked, Beatles, Stones, that sort of thing. Her brothers wanted to get into a little bit of heavier stuff, and her dad kept up very well. I was impressed. I was doing my best, and everyone was just looking at each other, having a great time. If you've ever been in a band, you know when you're in a groove. I know you're all wondering where this is going, but trust me, it's going somewhere. I had to go to the bathroom, so I decided to take a break and asked where the restroom was. They had one down in the basement, and they pointed it out, so I went down this little hallway to take a leak. As I was washing my hands, the light went out, and I fumbled for the switch to see if I'd touched it anyway. Before I could reach for it, the light came back on, and I swear on my grandmother's grave, there was a person standing behind me. I looked in the mirror and saw this guy right behind me, like his face almost on my shoulder. I jumped and made a little yipping noise, but the light went out again, and it immediately came back on, and no one was there. I know, this sounds like a movie, but this happened. I wondered if they had heard my little yipping noise, but I figured the music was so loud it was probably drowned out. I wanted out of that bathroom, but I didn't want to run out too fast, and I didn't know if I should ask any questions. I mean, maybe I was just seeing things. But at that point, it just felt so real. I decided not to say anything, just brush it off and play some more. Just like any other Thanksgiving, more beers arrived, and at this point the brother said we all should do a shot. I was a little worried about this, as I had a pretty long drive home, and that's when the father said that he was concerned about it as well, and then invited me to stay there, just for safety reasons. I thought, I'm okay with that, and my girlfriend looked really happy about it too. So I texted my mom and said I was going to stay there for the night. They just invited me, and they're really, really cool. She texted back a while later and said that was fine, and just to be safe. So, that shot comes, more beers, and everyone is getting a little lit at this point. We're all laughing and playing, and sometimes screwing up and laughing even harder. At some point, thinking that there was someone looking at us from down the hall where the bathroom was, I occasionally would look over my shoulder, but no one was ever there. When we finished a really bad version of Rock and Roll by Led Zeppelin, I looked back down the hallway, and there, standing in the doorway of the bathroom, was the same person I had seen standing behind me maybe an hour earlier. This time I said something about, "Is somebody else staying in the house?" Everyone laughed but didn't say anything and just said, "Maybe you need to lay off the sauce." I didn't want to look like an idiot, so I didn't say anything further about it, and we just played a couple of more tunes. We decided to wrap it up for the night and maybe watch some movies and just have more turkey sandwiches and some pie. We all put down our gear and made our way upstairs. My girlfriend held me back and wanted to have a quick makeout session, which I was more than happy to do. I was a little tipsy, but I was far from drunk. After a little bit, we didn't want to make it look too obvious, so we made our way up the stairs. To go up the stairs, you had to walk right by that hallway with the bathroom, which was maybe, right across the hall, a couple of arms lengths. As I was following my girlfriend up the stairs, admiring her backside, I felt a tug on my arm. I looked over and almost yelled again, as there, standing against the wall outside the bathroom, was that guy. I did jump up a bit, bumping into my girlfriend, who just giggled, thinking that I was flirting with her, but I wanted to get the hell out of that basement. We went upstairs and had some food and just relaxed, continuing to talk about music and the arts in general, as my girlfriend was studying photography and graphic design. We decided to watch some movies, and as the night wore on, everyone was starting to drop off to sleep from all the food and the beer. Before we fell asleep for good, Jill's mom said that she had set up a guest room for me upstairs, and there were towels on the bed. Jill said she'd show me where the rest of everything was upstairs when we decided to turn in. Her parents were heading upstairs, and as they went, we said our goodnights. But from the kitchen off to the left, I saw the figure of that guy again. I asked my girlfriend point blank at this point, "Who is that guy in your house that I keep seeing? I'm not crazy. I saw him downstairs, and I just saw him in the kitchen." She looked at me incredulously and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I tried to explain what had happened earlier, and she looked at me wide-eyed and said, "That's really scary, but I don't know what to tell you." We went back to see her brothers, and they looked creeped out too when I told them, and they wanted me to tell them what he looked like. I did my best to describe what he looked like, and they just looked at each other but didn't say anything. Everyone was really on edge now, so I figured, let's just let it go. And suddenly 4 more beers materialized, and I just decided to laugh it off and say, I must be seeing things. Must be nervous about meeting a new family, Well, we decided to turn in after my girlfriend and I were left alone downstairs and had some more fooling around time. She showed me to my room, then where the bathroom was, and we kissed again and said goodnight. When I lay down in my bed, I looked at my phone for a few minutes before really succumbing to the sleep that I needed. At about 2 in the morning, I woke up with kind of a start, freaked out, not remembering where I was. When it came to me that I was at my girlfriend's house, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. And I turned my phone light on to see what time it was. In the glow of the phone, right next to the bed, kneeling right near my head, was that guy. This time I did yell out, because I was going nuts at this point. When my phone light went off, and before I could turn on a light, the door opened and Jill and her mom were standing there. They flipped on a light, and of course, there was no one else in the room with me. They asked if I was okay, and again I told them about this guy, and I told them that I couldn't have been imagining it at this point. As we all kind of stood there talking, I looked over Jill's shoulder at a composite picture of her family with all of her aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents. I recognized one of the photos as the guy I kept seeing. I pointed right at him and said, "That's the guy, right there. I keep seeing this guy at your house." Jill and her mom looked at each other and shook their heads. Jill said, "That's my cousin Charlie. He's in the army, stationed overseas. He's in Germany right now." I just shrugged and said, "I don't know what's going on, but I tell you, I keep seeing this guy here." She tried to make a joke of it, and I realized that I looked like I was going bananas. It wasn't going to help anything, and I certainly didn't want this family to think I was crazy. So I chalked it up to, well, maybe I was just having a dream. I must have looked at that picture earlier, or maybe another one in the house, and it's just sticking with me. Everyone smiled and went back to bed. And the next morning we were having some breakfast, and now I was getting chastised for seeing a ghost in the house. I was taking the ribbing good-naturedly and just enjoying a cup of coffee. The phone rang and Jill's father answered it. He had a long, quiet conversation on the phone before returning to the dining room table. And when he sat down, Jill's mother immediately asked what was wrong, and he said that it was his brother Harry on the phone. His son, their cousin Charlie, had been in a car accident the day before, and had lost his life. This would have been right around the time I first caught a glimpse of him in the bathroom mirror. My face turned beet red as the entire family looked at me with eyes as wide as saucers. I shrugged and said, "I don't know what else to say. I was convinced that I saw someone here." I wasn't wanting to make a huge scene out of it, but everyone started talking about how bad they felt about Charlie and what a wonderful guy he was. I started feeling really awkward and kind of motioned to my girlfriend that I should probably get going at this point. I thanked everyone for having me to their Thanksgiving celebration, and everyone was really nice to me as I got my things together and made for my car. I told Jill I'd call her later, and I'm sorry if I disrupted anything in the family. And she said absolutely not. They like you very much. I drove home thinking the entire time about what I had seen, that I knew I had seen. But why their cousin chose me to be the one to appear to? I still think about that even though I haven't spoken with Jill or her family in a few years. We're friends on social media, but I would feel like a total asshole if I brought it up, so I try to just let it go when I do think about it. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Holiday from Hell, submitted by Jack Monitor 3. I hope this isn't too early in the season for a story like this. I'll get the backstory out of the way quickly. My wife left me and my daughter when she was only 4 and I was 30. She couldn't handle the pressure of being a parent and growing up, so she just up and left one day. Barely an explanation. Moved out of her duplex and filed for a divorce. She wanted no custody, no property, nothing. She came back to get all of her stuff, packed up her Jeep Cherokee, and took off. Not knowing what else to do, I agreed to the divorce, and the court proceedings were smooth as she didn't show up to anything and agreed to everything I asked for. Nothing else was smooth, though. I was more than upset, but I was focused on taking care of my angel, so I handled my personal stuff with counseling because I knew she really didn't understand what was going on. Her parents were beside themselves and begged me to still let them see their granddaughter. Of course I said okay. I was amazed how quickly my daughter got over it, though. You see, even when my wife was around, she wasn't really there. She did the bare minimum of taking care of our daughter. Feedings, changing in baths, sure, but that was it. She would park her in front of the TV, and that was about it. I was working 2 jobs and would come home and ask why they weren't outside on a walk or at the park or whatever, as the days were really awesome. If the weather was good, why they were staying inside. My ex would just say she wasn't feeling good. A long way down the road, I would find out that she was depressed, and I think Xanax or something became a bigger role in her life than she had expected, but now was on it all the time. After not hearing from my wife for nearly 3 years, my in-laws told me she was living on the West Coast with some guy she had met, but I stopped them right there. I didn't want to know any more than that. I got a postcard in the mail addressed to my daughter. It just said, "Soon," and had a heart underneath it. The card was postmarked Dos Palos, California, but wasn't signed. I did, however, recognize my wife's handwriting. I broke out my U.S. Atlas and looked it up. A city about halfway between Fresno and San Jose. I just shook my head and called my in-laws. They hadn't heard from her in a few months either, so they also thought it was odd. My mother-in-law said she'd try to reach out to her, and I just got on with things at home. Thanksgiving was coming up in a couple of weeks, and I was taking my daughter to my parents' house about an hour away in Des Moines. We lived outside of Cedar Rapids when this happened. The night before we made the trip, we were planning on staying for a couple of days so my angel could see my mom and dad for a while. She loved staying with them then, and still does now. As she's considerably older, I still love that. We had a great time. My dad and I got to watch football all day. I remember Dallas beating Detroit. And my brother and sister-in-law were there with their 2 kids. It was just a nice holiday. I had my daughter call my in-laws, and all was right with the world. We stayed until Saturday, just relaxing and doing some shopping. Good family time. When we got home Saturday afternoon, I knew right away something was very, very wrong. When we got out of the car, I noticed that the back door to our duplex had been damaged. More than damaged. It had been kicked in and then hastily closed some time after that. I was torn between going inside with my daughter and knowing that this wasn't right, So I got back in the car with her and took her to my best friend's house, who happened to be home with his fiancée, thankfully. I left her there, and my best friend went with me back to the house after I told him what I had seen. On the short drive over, I was trying to figure out if someone knew that I wasn't home and figured they'd rob the place. Not like I had tons of stuff that was worth lots of money, but I did have a number of handguns and rifles locked in my safe. Wishing I had my .45 on my hip, I went inside with my friend right behind me. The kitchen was fine, and so was the adjoining dining room. The living room was basically destroyed. Everything had been turned over, all the drawers had been opened, and my TV smashed. We stood looking over everything and remained quiet, both of us thinking or wondering if someone was still in the house. My gun safe was in the basement, so I took a chance to go down there before I checked the upstairs. The basement was fine, but I could tell someone had tried to get into my safe. So immediately I thought, okay, someone's looking for my weapons. I opened the safe quickly, holstered my .45, and handed my friend my Remington 870. We were taking no chances. We slowly went back upstairs, trying to be as quiet as possible, but in the back of our minds we knew if anyone was in the house, they would know we were already there. I yelled up the stairs, "If you are in my house, we are armed and will not hesitate to shoot. I'm giving you 60 seconds to come downstairs now." We sat and waited and heard nothing. We went up the stairs, and I immediately went into the bathroom that was at the top. No one was in there, and nothing was wrong. Good start. I checked my daughter's room first, and everything in there was strewn about as well. I couldn't tell if anything had been taken, but there was stuff all over the place, and I knew that we had left. A part of our agreement to stay long at Grandma and Grandpa's was my daughter had to help straighten out her room, and she had. I went into my bedroom while my friend checked my daughter's closet and under the bed, and I did the same in my room, which was also destroyed. All the drawers open, stuff had been thrown everywhere, but again, no one was in the room. The last room we checked was my little office area that I kept my Amiga in. It was also a spare bedroom. Again, no one was there, but my computer was gone, along with the extra cordless phone for the house. We both breathed a sigh of relief, and I went downstairs to find the other cordless to call the police and let them know we had a break-in. When I picked the line up, though, it was dead. I thought that was odd because the phone did turn on, but there was no dial tone. My friend offered to run outside, and sure enough, just like in the movies, the phone line had been cut. I closed the back door as best I could and drove to the police station. This was 1991, and I was nowhere near owning a cell phone at that time. We got to the police station, and I made a report and was sent back to my house with an officer. My friend went with me, and we showed him everything that we had seen in the house. Before we left the station, though, I called my landlord, who unfortunately was out of town for the holiday weekend as well. I left a voicemail on his machine to call me as soon as he could. The officer came to my house and obviously saw the damage and asked if I noticed if anything was missing. I told him I wasn't completely sure about my daughter's things, but the only thing that I noticed was gone was a phone and my Amiga. He made a detailed report and asked me to take pictures of everything, and also asked if I had pictures of the stuff that had been damaged before it had been wrecked. I scrambled around and found pictures of past holidays, and my daughter just doing cute little things that she was always doing around the house, so there was some sort of record. We had left the firearms in the house before going to the police, and I did tell them that none of my guns had been taken, but someone had been tampering with the safe. He made a note of it and then asked if I had renter's insurance, which I did not. I'm sure he wasn't trying to be a dick, but it pissed me off when he said, "Well, looks like you better look into that in the future." Okay, thanks, dude. I know you're doing your job, but that's not what I needed to hear right then. He completed his report and said there would be a follow-up and asked me to leave any numbers he might be able to reach me at. And that's when we remembered to tell him that the phone line had been cut. I gave him my friend's number as well as my parents' number, telling him I wasn't sure if I was going to stay at the house or go back to my parents. He said, "Thanks for the information, and I'm really sorry to see this happen. I hope the rest of the weekend goes well." He said he'd be in touch and left. I went back to my friend's house, tried calling the phone company to let them know I needed the phone fixed, and he invited me to stay the rest of the weekend with him, and he would help me fix the door. But something about this whole thing just didn't sit right with me. It dawned on me that this seemed to be a semi-inside job. My gun safe is pretty hidden away under the stairs in my basement, and I usually keep a heavy blanket over the front of it with some boxes at the feet of it and on top to give the illusion that there's nothing there but stuff stacked up. whoever broke in knew that those guns were there. It was then that I remembered the postcard from Dos Palos. I immediately decided to take my daughter back to my parents' house, then come back and fix the back door and wait out the phone company, hoping that this warranted an emergency service trip. Likely not, but I was willing to take the chance. I also, in the back of my mind, was planning on taking that Monday off before getting my daughter back to see if the police would be back and if anything else needed to be taken care of. Plus, I wanted to clean the place up and not freak out my daughter, who was now at the age where she would know something was wrong. I called my parents and told them what had happened and that I was bringing them my daughter back, and they were very angry and upset for me, but happy to be taking care of her. I said I was running back to the house to secure the door a little better, grab some more of my daughter's stuff for the next trip, and just make sure that everything in the house was locked up. I didn't know why I thought I should do that last one, but at this point I was taking no chances. It was about 6 in the evening when I went back, and I immediately went to the basement, unlocked the safe, and holstered my .45 again. I was taking it with me, and that was legal as I do have a full carry permit. I checked all of the windows in the house, got another bag out, and got more stuff for my daughter, and as I was just finishing up, I heard noise coming from the kitchen. I froze. I waited and listened and could hear 2 low voices talking. I immediately shut the light off in my daughter's room, and the rest of the house was dark now. Her bedroom door was the second closest to the stairs outside of the bathroom, so I braced myself in the doorway and again waited. I could hear whoever was in the kitchen now walking into the living room and stopping to talk again. I couldn't help notice that one of the voices was my ex-wife's. My heart was thumping 1,000,000 miles a minute. What was she doing here, and who was she with? As I heard the 2 of them start to come up the stairs, I had my .45 pointed directly down the hallway. They had a flashlight and had not turned on the hallway lights as they made their way up. The moment I saw the first shadow reach the top of the stairs, I switched on the light in my daughter's room and yelled, "Get the fuck on the ground!" The shadow, which turned out to be my ex-wife, gave out a scream and tried to go back down the stairs but ran into whoever was standing there. I couldn't have just shot a round off, as the bullet would have gone into my neighbors next door at the duplex, but I yelled again to get the fuck on the ground and called my wife by name. She slumped into the wall and into a ball and started crying. Now the footsteps down the stairs made their way quickly through the living room, through the kitchen, and out the back door. I didn't know what to do. I was standing there pointing a gun at my ex-wife, who was crying her eyes out and looked like shit, and I have no phone to call anyone for help. Thankfully, the walls of the duplex were pretty thin, and I've kept the pistol trained on my ex-wife, not knowing what she was capable of or if she had any weapons of her own, but I started banging on the wall above her head as hard as I could with my other hand. I actually broke through the drywall, and thank God my neighbor's wife was home. She started yelling at me, saying, "What's going on over there?" in a muffled voice, and I screamed for her to call the police and don't ask questions, just call the police. She did, and about 10 minutes later I heard someone at the back door yelling, "Police!" But during that 10-minute trip, I kept asking my wife what the fuck she was doing there and why she had done any of this. She wouldn't say anything, she just kept crying and crying. I was losing my shit and now screaming at her. The police obviously heard that, and after announcing themselves and me yelling back, "I have a woman at gunpoint who broke into my house, at the top of the stairs. I am armed." They said to back away from her and place my gun on the floor in front of me and then back up farther. I said okay. They came up and assessed the situation immediately, got my ex-wife to her feet, and led her down the stairs. Another officer came back up, nodded his head at me, and picked up my .45. There were tons of questions, of course. By this time my friend had come back, wondering where I was, but the police wouldn't let him in. More officers showed up, and I told them that my friend was with me when we first discovered the break-in, and he might be able to shed some light on things as well. My ex-wife was taken to the station for her questioning after they grilled her in the backyard of my place, but she wouldn't say anything. At first, she didn't even acknowledge when they read her rights. I had to go down to the station as well to fill out a report and get my side of the story out before they charged her with anything. Throughout the evening, it was determined that she had been part of a duo that had broken into my home. It was her new boyfriend. She broke down and admitted that they had driven from California hoping to snatch my daughter and take her back with them to California. The guy she was with took off on her, and it would be a while before the law caught up with him. They had it all planned out. They were not going back to Dos Palos, as they had been evicted from their apartment. My ex-wife said they had planned on going to some place called Clear Lake and try to start a new life with our little girl. Suffice it to say, this did not happen, and my little girl stayed with me safely. My ex-wife was charged with breaking and entering, damage to property, theft of property, and another bunch of things, but the most important charge was conspiracy to commit a kidnapping. For that, after a lengthy and bothersome trial, she was convicted and received 12 to 35 years for the conspiracy. She ended up doing 20 years of it and was let out in 2012. I believe she's still on parole, or probation, whatever you call it. I know she has tried to contact my daughter, but my daughter wants nothing to do with her. I waited until she was 18 years old to tell her the full story of what happened that night. Basically, after she abandoned us, she went to California and became a junkie and fell in with some really rotten bums. One of them was the guy she was dating, who convinced her to kidnap my daughter. They were both so strung out, they thought it was a good idea, and thought I would be home alone with my little girl on Thanksgiving. Thank God we had gone to my parents. My in-laws were also blown away to know that she and this guy had come into town a week earlier and had been watching their house too, to see if we would show up there for Thanksgiving. This has been a long one, I know, and it's taken me quite some time to write it out. I'm not the best typer in the world. After all this went down, I took a job in Des Moines and we bought a new house out there. Like I said in the beginning, I know this is early in the season, but feel free to use it whenever you like. I hope everyone has a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving. One interesting thing about all of this is that it brought my in-laws and my family together. I don't know why life works out like that, but we have a great relationship and now get together for Thanksgiving. My ex-wife is never on the guest list. Thanksgiving with Husband's Family by Just Laney. My first Thanksgiving with the family of my soon-to-be husband. It was in a house that was completely full of guests, and the toilets had been working overtime. No one told me that. It was a gorgeous formal dinner with copious toasting and rich, dreamy food. My body was a running machine in those days, and I was consuming mostly healthy food leading up to this moment. Well, 30 minutes after lunch, I began to feel very uncomfortable. Very. So I snuck off to one of the guest bedrooms upstairs, which, unfortunately for me, was located directly above the library where everyone had gathered to digest. After I began to feel some relief and started to feel human again, the toilet decided that I was the person, and this was the moment, to stop admitting new contents altogether. As I flushed, there was a discernible pop, gurgle, and then a volcano of waste and water began to saturate the floor. After what seemed like an eternity, I managed to turn the water off at the source and was left standing in a 2-inch lake of shit. As I stood in stunned horror, there was a frantic knocking at the door. It was my mother-in-law warning me not to flush. "Too late," I managed to whisper. She scurried off and I was left sobbing in mortification. In a flash, she brought back a stack of old towels, bleach, and a bucket, and I got to work. Finally, after 30 minutes of hysterical cleaning, crying, and laughing, I managed to sanitize myself and the bathroom. However, to my horror, as I walked down the stairs and looked into the library, I saw a bucket brigade and a frantic swarm of people up on stepladders holding towels up to a soaking, dripping ceiling. Yep, my shit was raining on my future family. I ran out of the house and refused to play in the croquet tournament the next day. The marriage didn't last. Thanksgiving with Unwanted Guest, submitted by Haroon5. First off, let me say I was a foster kid. I've never met my birth father and my piece-of-shit mother, who's tried to meet me more than a dozen times, but I remained steadfast in telling her to fuck off. She left me when I was just a baby. I'm not going to get into all that, but if she hears this, you can eat a bag of shit, lady. Not that this makes a difference in my story, but it does explain why I was by myself, and trusted to be so, and how driven I was. You'll get it. Anyway, sorry, I hate them both. But my foster parents were amazing, and I consider them my real parents, well, because they adopted me as their own after caring for me for 5 years until I was 7. They're both gone now, and I miss them. They were the only family I had. But I digress. When I was 18, I had earned enough credits to graduate high school early. My mom was an engineer and my dad was an electrician, and they promoted both trade education as well as intellectual studies. I grew up with books, music, hands-on learning experiences, and a healthy dose of reality. I mean, they were amazing. My senior year, I was working a capstone internship in CAD, so I only went to school half the day, and then I went and got paid to work at a really great place. For such a shitty start to life, I was killing it at this point. That Thanksgiving, my parents decided they wanted to take a trip down south to the Florida Keys to see some friends. They wanted me to go, but I knew that if I worked the day after Turkey Day, I would not only earn some extra ass-kissing points at my job, but I would also make time and a half with a comp vacation day that most interns didn't even get. We had a huge talk about me being home by myself, the rules of the house, and all that shit. Finally, it was decided they were going to go, and they trusted me to take care of myself. Cue my best friend Frank. Frank was also in my circle of CAD and such. He came from a very wealthy family, and he and I knew each other since I got into my foster family. He was one of the only people who knew my parents weren't my real parents, and he is still my best friend to this day. His parents were also going out of town for Thanksgiving, and therein lied the plot for us to have a little fun of our own at his house. It was going to be simple. A little smoky, some wobbly pops, a few close friends, and, well, you get the idea. We assembled our crew of Devin, Mike, and Angelo. I mean, total sausage fest, but so what? We were going to hang out, smoke a turkey, shoot some pool, etc. Devin got his brother to get us a couple cases of some local craft beers. Frank got the turkey going early that morning, and Ange brought the green. Frank's basement was really rad. It was finished with a full bar, a dartboard, pool table, a huge media center with one massive TV hooked up with an Xbox, and 3 TVs on the side that had sports games running. I was there at 11 in the morning, and I got a text from my mentor saying, "Hey, skip Friday. You'll still get paid, and you'll still get your comp day." Yes, things were looking great. The basement had windows and French doors to the outside where there was a patio and the grill and the smoker was. I mean, this was a righteous setup, no doubt. And by noon, all the guys were there, and we set in on the beverages. Ange had also brought an old Nintendo. We set up a Tecmo Bowl tournament for some fun. The turkey was turkeying, we were laughing and chilling, and all was well. Frank's backyard dropped off down to a lake, and all around it was a walking path in and out of the trees. When I went outside for a smoke, I looked down the hill and saw a guy dressed in all black walking on the path. I didn't think twice about it. I mean, who would? It was just some dude out for a walk. He went by and kind of looked up at me and then disappeared into the trees. A few minutes later, he came back, looked up, and then disappeared in the other direction. I went back inside. I was next up for the Tecmo Bowl. I was using Green Bay because I knew the trick of the nose tackle who could always sack on a run. Yeah, I'm a cheater. Anyway, a couple of more beers in, guys shooting pool, food was almost ready. Frank went to the door, opened it, and yelled out, "Hey, can I help you?" The rest of us looked over, and he yelled again, "Hey, what are you doing?" We all got up and went over to the patio to see this guy that I had seen earlier trying to climb a tree at the edge of the yard. He jumped down and ran to the footpath and was gone. I told the guys about what I had seen earlier, and we figured he was just some kook and went back inside. Frank and Ange had by now hit the bong a few times while they made stuffing and mashed potatoes upstairs and were laughing like all hell at some inside joke. We were laughing downstairs laughing at them, and then we began to eat and were talking about how great this day was. We were all crashing there, and we were talking about extending the party into the next day and also inviting some more guys to party that night. We all got on the phone, called about 4 more friends, and cleaned up the food. When the first guy, Paul, came over, he came in through the front door and immediately said, "Who's that weirdo out front?" He described the same kook we had seen, and all of us ran upstairs, but there was no one on the front lawn anymore. By now we were thinking something was more than up. We went back downstairs talking about it, and then the other guys showed up and we just kept partying. More beer, more food, and the weed was starting to take its toll as the four of us started to get sleepy while the other guys who would come later had just kept having fun. Maybe 45 minutes later, I awoke from dozing on the couch as another friend, Scott, said, "Guys, there's some dude at the door." Everyone looked over, and there, at the French doors onto the patio, with his hand on the doorknob, was that guy. But now he was wearing one of those rapist-style ski masks, you know, the ones with the holes for the eyes and mouth. The door was locked, thank God, and when we noticed him, he took off. Frank said he was going after him, but Ange told him not to. I mean, he could be trouble. We all relaxed and got back into the party, screwing around and watching football. It was now about 8 o'clock at night, and everyone was either pretty buzzed or high, and things were just toasty. Me and Paul went upstairs to get stuff for some sandwiches and some snacks, and that's when I noticed the front door was open. Not the outside glass door, but the heavy main door. Scott was the last guy to come over, so I yelled downstairs and said, "Hey, Scott, did you forget to shut the door?" He yelled back, "No." I took my shoes off and closed the door. Weird. But I just shut the door and we went to the kitchen. Paul took a pit stop in the bathroom, and when he came out, we both heard a thump coming from upstairs. "Probably Frank," I said, and we just took the food downstairs. But when we got there, we noticed that all the guys were there. I looked at Paul and then said aloud, "Guys, I know I'm a little bit high, and I'm not being paranoid, but something's wrong here." I told him about the door and that we had heard something upstairs. Everything was quiet except for the TV, which Devin finally turned off. Frank finally said, "Okay, fuck this, let's not get crazy, let's just check this shit out." One by one, we went upstairs, and when we walked through the kitchen and the dining room, we all met up again in the living room. And that's when we heard another thump from upstairs. Frank motioned to all of us with putting a finger to his lips. We followed him to the back hallway, and he went into his garage. We went out with him, and he pointed at his family's set of golf clubs. Everyone grabbed one, and for some reason, he had a cricket bat. I mean, I didn't even know what it was at the time, but I picked it up. Maybe half the guys stayed downstairs in the living room, while Frank, Ange, Mike, and me went upstairs as quietly as we could. There were 4 bedrooms, a study, and 2 bathrooms up there, so walking softly on the carpet, we split up in 2 directions to check things out. Frank and I went into his bedroom, and then his sister's. No one was there. Ange and Mike checked out the other rooms, and again, nothing. Then we heard another bump coming from his parents' room. We all looked at each other and went in. There was an ensuite bathroom and a walk-in closet, so we also went in pairs to check both. Ange and Mike went to the closet, and I can't tell you how tense we all were. The smoke and wobbly pops had worn off, let me tell you. There was another soft bump coming from the closet. Frank went past the guys and opened the door and flicked on the light, and at first we didn't notice anything. But then Frank slashed out with the golf club that he was holding and cracked someone's legs that was behind his dad's suits. The guy who was standing there let out a yell and burst through the clothes. We got the shock of our lives. It was the guy from outside. He still had his ski mask on, and in his hand was a turkey wing he'd been eating. But what was crazy was the look in his eyes and the fact that he was not wearing his dark clothes anymore, but Frank's mother's clothes. No shit. Pantyhose, a bra, and a blouse. He screamed like a woman and lunged at Frank when I jabbed the bat right into his sternum as hard as I could and he fell back. Frank slammed the door shut, and Mike, me, and Frank put our bodies up against it while yelling for one of the guys to call the cops. The guy was now yelling in a language I didn't recognize and was pounding on the door. Every once in a while, I could make out a battered, "kill you fucker" in broken English. I thought maybe it was Polish or something, but we were getting too busy yelling on our own to think about it. This nut just kept trying to get out. The house was in an uproar, and it was about 15 minutes later when a car pulled up and 2 cops came to the door. The guys downstairs said there was someone upstairs that we had trapped, and they ran up and told us to stand back. I almost shit myself when they pulled out their guns and opened the closet door. The guy almost fell out onto them, and they immediately got him handcuffed. We all had a lot of explaining to do, and despite our pleas to not tell Frank's parents about what had happened there, as there was nothing stolen or broken, the lieutenant or whatever, their boss, showed up, and he realized right away that we'd been drinking and smoking, and of course, there were no parents around. After the story was told and we gave him all the details, he went back to his car and came back a while later. He wasn't super nice, but he was being pretty cool when he said he had to contact Frank's parents, but was going to give us a break. I told him I was really the only one supposed to be there, and he said, "Okay, that's your story. Just you two. The rest of you are not to leave this house tonight. Sober up, get your shit together, and clear out in the morning." He motioned his hand as if to say, "Give me the weed," and Ange handed over his satchel. The cop shook his head and said there would be a follow-up. We kept it low-key for the rest of the night. You better believe that. We finished off the beers, cleaned everything up, and then just watched TV for the rest of the night. Frank's parents, of course, got the call to get the full story, and they were really cool about it, too. Frank did get lectured about locking the front door, but that was about it. We learned that the guy was a homeless person from the next town over and had some pretty serious mental issues going on. I guess it's more sad than scary at this point. So, that's my story. A crazy homeless guy snuck into my friend's house, ate some food, dressed up in women's clothing, and was hauled away. Happy that no one got hurt, because he did have a pocket knife in his coat that he had left on the floor when he put Frank's mom's stuff on. I haven't had a Thanksgiving like that since, and I don't want to either. Noise on the Bottom Bunk by DJ. This encounter happened when I was 12. It was a week before Thanksgiving 1997, and I had gotten suspended from school for about 3 to 4 days for something petty. On the first day of my suspension, I was awakened by the sound of the plastic cover moving on the bottom bunk. The plastic protective covering was never taken off at the time. I looked at the clock on the dresser and was thinking that my little sister, who slept on the bottom bunk at the time, was going to be late for school. I dozed back off for a few minutes until the sound woke me up again. I told my sister she'd better get up or she's going to be late, but she didn't answer. The noise continued on in intervals. It was exactly as if someone were taking their hands and rubbing it across the plastic, but the noise was only coming from the part towards the foot of the bed and nowhere else. What was also strange was that there was absolutely no body movement behind it, just noise. Directly across from the bunk, about 5 feet away, was a large dresser with a large mirror built into it. I looked at the clock, then sat up in bed and moved over to look into the mirror down under the bottom bunk to tell my sister to wake up. I was confused briefly when I looked down and noticed that no one was there. At that very moment, the plastic made the noise again from the same spot I was looking at. I got so scared that I literally leapt off the top bunk and ran out of the room, leaving the door open, and I ran into my parents' room, where my dad was still asleep. My mom had already gone to work. I was so scared that I got into bed with my dad and woke him up, telling him what happened, but he just kind of shook it off and went back to sleep. After some time, I could still hear the noise carrying on in my bedroom at different intervals, but eventually it stopped completely. I was still scared, but I felt comfortable being around my dad, so I was finally able to get some more sleep. Around 11 a.m. he woke up and woke me up as well, telling me to get ready as we were going uptown for a while before he had to leave for work. It took my mind off things, and eventually I had forgotten about what had happened earlier. Around 1 p.m. or so, we came back home, and he had to leave for work, so I was left home alone until my mom and little sister came back around 4. I was having fun playing with one of my handheld games in the den. I mean, if anyone remembers those R-Zone things from back in the mid to late 90s, and I was just hanging out watching TV on the couch. Time went on, and I was just chilling. Then out of nowhere, the exact same noise from down in my bedroom started up again. I turned the TV down and just froze. And this time around, the noise was more loud, intense, and continuous. I mean, it was as if someone was deliberately trying to scare me or get my attention. It was only the plastic covering on the bed making the noise. Nothing else. I was scared stiff, but I tried to lean back slowly on the couch to look down the hallway towards the bedroom to see if I could see anyone moving in the room. I didn't see anything, and the bedroom was well lit from the sunlight shining through one of the windows. It took every bit of courage for me to slowly get off the couch and hide behind it so that who or whatever was down in the room wouldn't eventually come out and see me. At this point, I was almost crying, and I had to use the bathroom badly, but all I could do was hold it and stay frozen behind the couch in that one position. The noise continued on for hours, up until about 30 minutes or so before my mom and little sister came home, which was around 4:30 or so. I'd never been so glad in my life to see someone else. I don't think I told my mom what happened, but later on that night I told her that I wanted to take the plastic cover off the bottom bunk. So we did. I checked the plastic carefully for holes, just in case maybe an animal or something may have gotten into it and it was moving around, but there were no holes to be found. I checked under the bed and found nothing. The ceiling fan and air vent wasn't on and had no way of blowing on the bottom bunk anyway, so that was out of the question altogether. The rest of my days home from suspension went on without an event. Though I was still wary, I wasn't scared anymore. At the time, during the encounter, I wasn't even thinking about a ghost, but it dawned on me later that it might have been one. The question that plagued me was, why was it trying to scare me? And why was it focusing only on the plastic covering on the bed? Whatever it was or its reason, it was the scariest thing I've ever went through to date. Nowadays, as I reflect back on it, I definitely believe it was possible poltergeist activity, and not just an average spirit passing through. Thanksgiving Creep in China. Submitted by Anna. This is a long one, but I'm trying to keep as many details as possible because this happens in China, and I'm not sure how many listeners you have from China who have ever been there. About 5 years ago, I had to be in China for a trade show on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving in the States, that is. The Chinese do celebrate their Thanksgiving, but it's earlier in the year and not really like what we do back home. First off, let me say it was odd being away from my family and friends for the first time, but work was work, and I do love to travel. I was there with a coworker I'll call Susan. We were both in our late 20s and there to do some marketing and publicity with trade papers and magazines for a client. It doesn't matter who, and most of you would find what I do pretty boring. Outside of the client people, Susan and I were the only agency people at the show. What was cool was the client reps were super awesome to us and took us to all the cool spots on downtime. And one good friend, Zhang Min, invited us to her villa to celebrate Thanksgiving U.S. style, but with Chinese cuisine. We were excited to say the least. An afternoon of drinks and fun, and it was our last day of the show. Susan and I were staying for 3 more days to sightsee. The show wrapped up at noon, and the last days of any shows are total snoozers. Most everyone we needed to meet with had already left, and the organizers always seemed to put the most boring presenters on the last day. We were anxious to get out, get changed, and meet Zhang and head to her place. I cannot stress enough how rare this is, as most homes are not that large. Her father was the CEO of the company that we were working for, and people like to have larger gatherings at restaurants, so again, like I said, this was rare. Her family welcomed us in, and introductions were made all around. Our Shanghainese was good, hence why we worked for who we worked for, but Zhang's family, parents and 2 brothers, insisted on speaking English for good practice, as her father said. One of her brothers had invited a friend. I'll call him Lee. Right away, I got a weird vibe from him. He didn't say much, although his English was very good, but he did stare at me a lot over the course of the afternoon and evening. At one point, the beer I had been drinking and the stuffiness of the house was getting to me, so Zhang and I went outside for some air. They lived in a very nice neighborhood, so we sat on the steps of her villa and talked. At one point, I looked over at a window, and there was Lee, staring at me still. I asked her about him, and she shrugged and said she didn't really know him, only that he hung out with her brother. We went back inside to eat, and her mother had made all kinds of great things. They really made us feel at home. Following the rules of etiquette, we were all seated around a big round table. Across from Susan and I were her brothers and Lee, so I tried to not look too freaked out when Lee kept staring. At one point I began to wonder if he had a handicap or something. That's when I felt a foot touch my foot. At first I thought it was Susan trying to give me some kind of signal, but it became apparent it was not her. It was Lee. Creepy factor now in full effect. We continued to enjoy the meal with her father, talking about how he came to where he was, and stories about growing up poor, moving to the States and then coming back. It was fascinating, but the foot thing kept going on, and I tried to keep my feet as far away from him as possible. After we ate, Young had another surprise. She had gotten us a table at a high-end nightclub with bottle service. She invited some of her other friends and was excited for us to see another side of Shanghai. She got ready, and then we went back to our rented apartment to get spruced up. People not familiar with clubs like this should know that anyone going out then looks like they're fresh from the salon with their best clothes on. It's not like a college town bar. We were all gussied up and ready for a fun night out. But when we got to the club, I found out that Lee had been invited too. And it became pretty clear, pretty quickly, that once outside of a household setting, he was not as quiet. In fact, he was a totally different person. He was loud and boisterous and kept referring to me with a word I was unfamiliar with. There's lots of words in China that some areas say differently, by the way. But he would say it to the other guys and point at me. And I asked one of Zhang's friends what it meant, and she rolled her eyes and said it meant hottie in English. I also rolled my eyes. I mean, I'm not a dog, but I'm no come-hither beauty either. But then I overheard him say something that was totally uncool. This I understood, and it was basically, and you fill in the blank here, I'll have her sucking my blank. I began to get really uncomfortable, and what was once a fun night of drinking and playing dice didn't matter. I didn't want to be there anymore. Susan kept telling me to laugh it off, but the last comment was too much. I got up to go to the restroom when Zhang came with me. On our way back to the table, I stopped to adjust my shoe, and when I stood up, Lee was right in my face with a scary-looking grin on his face. It wasn't pleasant at all. I said something like, excuse me, and tried to get around him, but he just shifted in front of me again. Now I was a little pissed, and I said, I'm not interested, and I'm not kidding. He said, oh, you're interested, I can tell. I tried to move around him again, and this time shot past him and got back to the table. I told Susan what had happened, and that I really wanted to go back to our place. She was more than drunk at this point, was just laughing. I told Zhang what was going on, and she said something to her brother, and he just sort of shrugged. Now I was not only pissed at this guy, but also at Susan. I made my mind up to leave without her and just go back to our rented apartment. Probably a dumb idea, but I was irritated and mad. I told Zhang I was going, and said something to Susan, who just kind of laughed again. Zhang said she understood and called a taxi for me. I stalked outside of there, hurt and pissed. When I got into the taxi, I turned around to see Lee staring at me. He had followed me out and watched me get in the cab. I didn't care. I was just thankful to be getting away from that scene. I calmed down a bit and was feeling better when I got to the place I was staying at. There was a gate around the building, and I felt even better when I got through there, went up the 5 flights and into our tiny room. I collapsed in a floor chair and just sat there for a few minutes. For some reason, I knew I wanted another drink and remembered we had some things we got as part of our trade show goodies. I opened a small bottle of baijiu and poured some in a cup, sat in the dark sipping it. After about a half an hour, I thought I heard a noise outside my door. The doors at this place were not the strongest things in the world, and there was a tiny gap at the bottom. I bent down a little bit, and I could see 2 black shadows, obviously feet, right outside the door. There was no peephole on the door, and I heard a soft scratching noise, too. Then a soft whisper. I know you're in there, hottie. Come let me in. I sat back down quietly and didn't say anything. The tapping and scratching continued. The shadows on the floor did not move. I was thinking if I should call the police, but I'd never had to do that, and I really don't even know how they operated. But the tapping got louder, and he said, Juno, open up. Let me in, Juno, which is basically calling me a slut or a whore. Now I was really getting nervous. I tried calling Zhang and Susan, but neither of them answered, and they were probably even more drunk at this point. But now, he was practically punching the door, and I called out, "Go away, Lee. I'm calling the police." He just laughed, and I wondered why no one else on the floor was coming up to see what was going on. Then something came through the little crack under the door. I didn't want to turn the light on, but did, and saw that it was a condom. "I promise I won't be too rough, Ginu." His pounding became harder, and finally he said, "Let's F, Ginu. No more playtime." I was sweating and really scared. I kept trying to call Susan and Zhang to no avail, and by now he was fooling with the swipe card lock and punching the door. And returned to punching the door. Then, thank God, I heard peals of laughter from down the hallway. The pounding stopped, and the shadows disappeared. Zhang and Susan were there, coming down the hall, completely smashed, and as mad as I was with them, I was so happy that they chased this creep away from my door. I still don't even know how he got in. They both came in, and I burst into tears, and they sobered up a bit and asked what was wrong. I told them the whole thing, and Zhang got on her phone after plugging it in. It had been dead. She called her brother and yelled at him about Lee and said what he had been up to. She hung up, and we all sat on the floor. Susan said she was so sorry she wasn't paying attention and poured me some more baijiu to calm down. Eventually I did calm down and fell asleep on the floor. We all did. It was over, and I didn't see Lee for the remainder of the time we were there, thank God. Zhang told me her brother confronted Lee, and he told him that I basically had led him on, had been touching his feet at the dinner, and then invited him back to the apartment only to get there and then not let him in. So, yeah, nothing physical happened to me, but after a long week of work and not knowing what to do in an emergency in a foreign country, psychologically, I was spent. It wasn't until I was on the plane heading home that I truly felt safe. I've been back to Beijing and Shanghai more than once since then, but thankfully never ran into anyone else like Lee, and I never celebrated Thanksgiving there again. Okay, guys, this one is kind of scary. It's a little more gross than anything else, which is scary in its own way. It's kind of funny, too. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Turkey Disaster by Soft Burrito. I have a big chest freezer in my basement, and last year when turkeys were cheap for Thanksgiving, I picked up an extra one and put it in there. A few weeks ago, I noticed a smell coming from that area, and it turns out my cat, or kid, who knows, had accidentally bumped and unplugged the freezer. In horror, we turned it back on and got everything out and into the trash except the turkey, because we live in the country and didn't want to put it out until right before the trash came so it wouldn't attract coyotes. Yes, this is a legitimate concern at my house. Well, we forgot about the damn turkey. That is, until the day when the smell had finally busted through the freezer, hitting my nostrils with something akin to the scent I envisioned a bag full of buttholes might have on a muggy summer day. I ran downstairs to grab the stupid thing, and at this point even coyotes weren't going to be eating it. Its putrid turkey juices had frozen it solid to the floor of the freezer. Since there was nothing else in there, I unplugged it, assuming a few hours later I could plop that stink balloon of meat loose, but nope, it was still stuck. Also, to make a bad situation worse, I decided dumping a pot of hot water in there would loosen up the death grip the turkey corpse had on my freezer. What a mistake. While it did not loosen the frozen seal, it did create some kind of a filth brew, like the devil himself had made a turkey ooze brine in my basement freezer. Desperate, I huddled next to the meat sludge potpourri with a hairdryer, but all that did was cook the aforementioned death broth, sending its putrid aroma off in great billowing gasps up the stairs, through the air ducts, and between the walls. It was about this time the neighbor kids stopped by, and their words when my door opened were, Oh, God, why does your house smell like that?" By now the smell had embedded itself not just in my house, but in my hair, and I'm guessing my very soul. It was so deep in my nostrils that even fresh air smelled like death. By 8:30 that night, the turkey had won the day. I left the freezer to thaw more, hoping to be able to wrench it loose the next day. So I woke up early, bought 2 Glade scented candles, 4 things of Audubon, Febreze trash bags, and a bag of rock salt. Why the rock salt? Because the stank brine actually froze overnight. Froze solid in my freezer that had been turned off with the lid wide open for 24 hours. How? And where was this tenacious freezing ability when the plug got knocked loose? I was baffled and kind of impressed. So now the turkey was stuck in its own personal stank brine iceberg like some horrific twist on the Sword in the Stone. I poured salt on the bad boy to loosen the ice, and then waited. Also, fun fact, if you light clean linen scented candles to mask the smell of rotting meat, your house just ends up smelling like someone stuffed a decaying animal with a lot of dryer sheets. Several hours later, the smell had become totally unbearable. I grabbed a shovel and plunged it into the icy hell broth, using it as a pry. In the process, I dented the hell out of the freezer liner, and my husband was mad, but I didn't care, because at that point I was planning on throwing it away. Not just the freezer, but the whole frickin' house. The shovel thing didn't work, and festering went on. The smell escalated, and I had an idea. Another horrible, awful idea. Technically, only the turkey wrapping was stuck. If I were to cut away the plastic and free the rotting bird from its frozen womb, I could end this all. Before I could talk myself out of it, I took a deep breath and plunged my bare hands into the package, tugging on the foul carcass. My hands burned in the cold, and for one horrifying moment I thought I'd rip it in half. A foul yellow jelly coated my hands, and the smell burned my eyes. I gave one final pull, powered by sheer adrenaline, and it came loose. I stuck the green, yellow, and purple lump of flesh in a bag and ran as fast as I could for the trash outside. Finally, it was done, but I will never feel clean again. Now I began the slow and painful path towards being whoever I will be after this, because seeing a thing like this, smelling a thing like this, I'm not going to lie, it changes a person. I should have a commemorative t-shirt made, or maybe get a tattoo or something to mark the struggle. Is this why those guys in prisons have tattoos of teardrops on their face? Probably, I'll figure it out. The real icing on this cake of meat stank, though? I'm a vegetarian. I wouldn't have eaten the damn bird anyway. I just got it to feed my meat-loving family. In my heart, I know tofu never would have done me dirty like this. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature you'd like to hear narrated on this channel and podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. And of course, if you have a Thanksgiving story or a Christmas story, send that in as quickly as possible. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And of course, follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. Feel free to leave a comment. I will get back to you as soon as possible. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.